Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to what seems to have been an extremely interesting and exciting afternoon. I'm going to start with a bit of an anecdote of where I was on 9/11, and I know that this is a commonplace, and I'm not the first one this afternoon starting this way. But I want to share with you because it was very much of an eye-opener at that time for me, fresh postgraduate, starting working for a development NGO, passionate and really committed, as probably most of you are right now. And I was having a meeting at the European Parliament with an MEP on development finances. And as the planes were crashing onto the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, fear spread, as you may know, that they would crash as well in other key institutions for world politics. As you know, Brussels politicians tend to think that Brussels is the center of the world. So all of a sudden, there were all these official cars leaving the parliament and a rush of all the MEPs to leave the parliament. And obviously I followed and tried to leave the parliament and was suddenly stopped by a security person saying, well, let's do that orderly, so let's wait until the parliamentarians leave, actually. So it was an eye-opener experience for me on what I call playing politics with poverty, and I'm going to tell you about in a minute, because I realized that actually global politics and the Titanic had a much closer resemblance than I would have ever thought. And actually, in times of global crisis and global problems, the weakest link always suffers the most. And this is what happened to a great extent with development aid and the poorest of the poor and the excluded of this world. However, not everything was bad news. The 9/11 actually in development finance brought a lot of good things. In a time record for international negotiations, in a matter of few months, the world leaders actually met in Monterrey, in Mexico, to agree one of the most groundbreaking and progressive agreements we ever had in the history of development aid and development finance. And this was the Monterrey Consensus. Probably lots of you studying international politics and development aid are familiar with the Monterrey Consensus. I don't want to go in detail. I just want to underline that it was really an achievement of global justice movements that after decades in the Cold War of suffering of a type of aid and development cooperation that was extremely politicized and used as a foreign policy tool. Lastly, the Jubilee campaigns, Live Aid campaigns felt that this international agreement addressed root causes of poverty and issues of debt cancellation, foreign direct investment, trade justice were addressed in a very progressive and groundbreaking way in this consensus. It is also striking the time record in which it was negotiated. If you talk to UN negotiators, it takes years to make an agreement. And after the 9/11, it took only a few months. The consensus was agreed and signed in Monterrey in March 2002. So that was very soon after the attacks. The Europeans also made their own commitments. They made their own work, their own homework, and basically they set for the first time a timetable to achieve what had been a 3-4 decade commitment of governments under the United Nations to reach an 0.7 of GNI of developed countries for development aid. So we got, at least on paper, the closest that we had ever been to delivering the 0.7. And actually, this delivered in practice a massive scale-up of ODA, of development aid. As you see here from 2001, the line goes up drastically, and to a great extent, it's the result of these strong commitments that leaders took in the wake of the 9/11. But it's not all good news. In any good story, there's good and bad news. And the bad news is that lots of this aid that was a scale up and increase was very much distorted by political interests and security interests. For instance, in 2005, European leaders restated that their commitment that European aid should be targeted to the neediest of the world, to the poorest of the world, but don't miss an extra line that they added in what it's called the EU Development Consensus, which has been the backbone of European development aid and development finance in the last few years. Without peace and security, development and poverty eradication are not possible, and without development and poverty eradication, no sustainable peace will occur. To add to this, actually, Javier Solana also said, European system programs, including the European Development Fund, can also have an impact on security of Europe and of third countries. I think these declarations are very important to realize that actually at the beginning of the decade, there was a shift in the development paradigm, strengthening much more the nexus between development and security that we had seen at least in the 90s, and shifting towards what could be called a security first paradigm in development aid. At the OECD also there were very worrying developments. The OECD Development Assistance Committee, as you know, sets the rules of what aid flows can be counted as aid as such and what cannot be counted. There were developments in 2003 and 2004 that started blurring very much the lines of what can and cannot be counted as development and as development aid, and discussions were restarted on whether budget allocations, definitions of aid, levels of aid, eligibility criteria should be opened up in order to bring in under the umbrella of development aid many items that actually are much closer to what we could or should call military spending or humanitarian assistance, not so much development aid. All these debates are still open, and still today at the OECD DAC, there's many countries, Sweden but others, that are still pushing for these definitions. In the diversion of the European aid towards more politicization and securitization, we've seen just last year evidence that this is still very much on the table. At the creation of the European External Action Service, there were a lot of demands from NGOs that development officials, that the development institution should be preserved as a separate architecture. And we lost the battle. And nowadays, this is merged into the same institutional setup that actually works on the foreign policy of Europe as a bloc. Some striking figures of what happened actually in practice. In practice, aid allocation and the quantities disbursed changed massively. We looked at the 10 first recipients of EU aid and changes from the beginning of the decade towards the mid and the end of the decade. And actually, we saw a massive shift in the countries that were in the top 10 recipients. Just to give you a few figures, I don't want to overwhelm you too much. For instance, Iraq moved from 2003 to receive only 1/3 of all aid to the Middle East, in 2004 to receive 2/3. This is a massive shift in just 1 year for development aid. Afghanistan moved from 2003 to 2004 to receive 1/5 of all aid to South and Central Asia to receive 1/4. And for instance, countries such as Pakistan and Ethiopia, that also were deemed to be allies in the global war on terror, increased respectively 50% and 100% the amount of aid that they receive from European Union countries. The case of Pakistan, it is striking. I don't need to go in detail because you've heard a lot about it. The way it moved in a very short time to be a pariah state, to be a donor darling basically, and receive massive amounts of aid. But it was not only on the amounts of aid allocated and disbursed to certain countries that were allies of the global war on terror, but also on debt cancellation. As you know, in Gleneagles in 2005 and during the 2000s, there were important agreements on debt cancellation. And out of this debt cancellation, actually, 2 countries, Iraq and Nigeria, received almost 3/4 of all debt cancellation that can be counted as development aid. This slide here shows you actually. Again, I'm running out of time, so I cannot explain in detail, but very happy to explain afterwards that if you deduct debt cancellation to Nigeria in Africa, actually aid to Africa decreased in the mid-2000s. So there was a lot of talk in the European Union that we were scaling up aid to Africa. This was actually not true. Just to finalize, there's been a lot of missed opportunities. Increased transparency, for instance, in exchange of information when it comes to financial flows linked to terrorism, but Another campaign that CSOs are backing, which is exchange of information on tax evasion from poor countries, could have also benefited from this increased financial transparency, and it has not. So clearly there is a matter of political will on what can and cannot be done and how aid can and cannot be disbursed. On top of all these trends in the politicization and securitization of aid, the global financial and economic crisis has come to increase the commercialization of aid. So I would like to finish with the following note. As I started, in cases of global crisis, be it the global war on terror or the global economic financial crisis, the poor are the ones who have the greatest chances to lose. And actually, poverty focus of aid and of development finance and development cooperations has become and will be one of the main challenge for civil society associations and aid activists. I'm sure we can make it, and just seeing the level of interest in the room of younger generations, I'm sure that 10 years down the line, you can be proud that you will have achieved it. Thank you.